I guess the question is, when we talk about building capacity and capability, actually capability, like a huge part of that, I would propose, and this is just my view, is that very much needs to be around the human, the awareness of how we show up in this and our role in this.
Yes.
And if I can reflect on that a bit more, because when we think of missions, like why are we even calling it a mission? It's because it's something we haven't done before. We're having to go beyond what we think is possible. And how do we create safe spaces for us to do that, knowing we may fail?
Right.
And if we, so I think that at the very essence of creating environments for missions and for innovation requires vulnerability. It requires failing at a time in which those who are trying to move this along don't feel like there's any space to do so.
Georgia, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and where are you this delightful July morning?
Well, thank you. Excited to be here and to be speaking to you. So I'm currently based in Earlsfield, so southwest London.
I'm glad you said that. I had no idea where that is. Okay, so you're in the UK, because when we first met, you were in New Zealand, and in
Correct.
between you've been elsewhere. All right,
Yeah.
you can tell us a bit about that as we get through. You are the Policy and Innovation Lead at the Net Zero Cities as part of Dark Matter Labs or separate to Dark Matter Labs. I'm not entirely clear, so you can explain that as we go through. And it just seems one of the most exciting things that is happening in terms of transition to a genuinely regenerative future. So can you tell us a little bit about what Net Zero Cities is about, how long it's been going, what its aims are, and how you got involved? And if we can do all of that in less than an hour, I'll be really impressed. So wherever you want to pick up with that, go for it.
Certainly. So first and foremost, I'm primarily part of Dark Matter Labs and the Policy and Innovation Lead within Dark Matter Labs. Now, within the Dark Matter Labs spaceship, so to speak, there is a team of us that are primarily dedicated towards what's called the 100 Climate Neutral and Smart Cities by 2030 mission. Now, that's one of 5 missions that's been established by the European Commission. So Net Zero Cities is a consortium of about 33, 34 partners from across Europe who have come together in order to support these 112 cities, actually, even though it's a 100 city mission, because a number of them aren't necessarily in the EU, so to speak. But the Net Zero Cities Consortium is basically a collection of us brought together to deliver support for these cities.
Brilliant. Okay, and so this was part of the EU. You mentioned the EU Commission. To what extent was this a Dark Matter Lab innovation, and to what extent was it Europe, or was it both together? Can you tell us a little bit more about the roots of it? How they decided that 100 cities would be a good thing? I mean, 100 is a round number. But why? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, certainly. So I think first and foremost, it's worth noting that this concept of missions has been around for quite a while, but it became rather prevalent again during the 2015 onwards with the work of Mariana Mazzucato and the pitch of missions and mobilizing missions, particularly her books around emission and economy. It came out the later part of the 2020s, but also earlier in what is the role of the public sector, and predominantly what is the role of public power in leveraging or collectively responding to the crises of our time. And how do we centralize and collectively organize around key challenges rather than necessarily have various projects which are all in a fragmented sense trying to respond to the various threads of this collective crises we face. So Mariana Mazzucato, as part of her work with the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose and also her previous work, pitched to the Commission the need for grand missions. And I mean, I won't go into too much detail on this, but effectively her pitch was, given the amount of funding that the Joint Research Centre was focusing on research and innovation in the Commission, within Europe, what would it look like if that funding was organised around 5 missions? And one of those is the 100 Climate Neutral and Smart City by 2030 missions. There is another one on cancer. I can actually summarize briefly what all of those are. So the EU missions effectively were proposed as being a new way for delivering kind of concrete solutions to some of our biggest challenges. That's how it was pitched. And it's how do we organize funding around 5 core challenges that then provides a basis for bottom-up innovation to occur. So how do we create the conditions for then research across Europe to then be focused around various ways to meet those missions? And so those missions, they're usually time-bound, like 2030, for example. But the 5 that they focused on as EU missions as part of the Horizon Europe program were the EU Cities mission. It was a soil deal for Europe. It was a restore our oceans and waters by 2030. It was the cancer mission, and then mission adaptation to climate change.
Wow.
So
Gosh, actual joined up thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the pitch. And of course, this has never been done before. Often there's been a lot of funding in various directions, of course, with similar things around similar crises, but not in a way that really demands a level of kind of almost a platform approach and a joined up thinking approach across Europe.
Right.
So,
Right. Gosh, and I'm thinking this is going to take us at a bit of a tangent, but I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Dr. Jenny Goodman, who's an ecological doctor, and I had not really taken on board the extent to which human health and planetary health are so completely interlinked. And her big thing about cancer was there was no way we're going to solve cancer unless we sort out industrial farming, heal the soils, sort out what we're breathing in, heal the water. While we're drinking water that's got forever chemicals in it, we can do all we like on the end stage of what can we give people once they've got some kind of oncological emergency. But we need to get to the bottom root cause. So this is not the cities, but I'm wondering to what extent that kind of thinking is beginning to filter through at an EU level, because that would be completely transformative. And it would mean a lot of the lobbying and the, what seems to me, overt corruption of our political system would have to stop. And that would be game changing. This is probably not something you can answer. So let's step away from it, actually, unless you really want to. Because that would be amazing. And I am aware in the UK that Mariana Mazzucato is really influential with Labour Party thinking. So hopefully they are going to have similar mission-led, joined-up thinking where you stop having these little polarized fiefdoms where people are basically fighting each other for little pots of money and everything else gets left behind. So let's head back into cities. Climate neutral and smart by 2030. Can you explain a little bit about what each of these means and why they have been brought together within that mission?
So I wonder if it's worth reflecting on it's climate neutral deliberately because it's not just about carbon. Even though I think carbon's a really key and important indicator for accountability.
Right. Yep.
And in terms of the sort of objective and subjective measures that we hold, it is a critical one. But it is not the only one, as we well know.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think in calling the consortia, which supports the mission, Net Zero Cities, I think that sometimes is a bit misleading, and I don't think it fully represents the momentum and the focus of the consortium on what does it mean to get these cities as close to and on the trajectory to climate neutrality smart by 2030 and onwards 2050. And specifically, if we're thinking about these 100 or 112, technically, cities, really there are 2 key focuses here. One is to support them to get as close on that trajectory as possible, but secondly, to be living labs, to be like lighthouses, effectively, other cities to follow within their countries and also across Europe up to 2050. And so there is a real focus on learning here. And so when we think of climate neutrality and smart, I guess, we're looking at not just the reduction in carbon emissions within a city's boundaries, 80% reduction of 1990 levels, for example, but we're also looking at what does it look like for you to transition in a way that is just. Because as we well know, a just transition is there is no transition without a just transition, so to speak. And I think when it comes to SMART, what they're trying to indicate or reflect is there is a role for technology, but I don't think that's not the primary goal. But also I think there's a lot we can learn from some of the shifts in digital technology, particularly around the role of governance and policy making in terms of data collection, getting clear on what we do or don't need to know and why and how we monitor that.
Right.
I think there is some great technological innovation that will support in this transition, but that is not the transition. And I think it's important to make that clear, and that there aren't a number of technological solutions for this
Okay.
crisis, but
Okay.
there is a need to be able to leverage technology as and when it is helpful, while also knowing that this is a human transition.
Brilliant.
This is a transition of how do we live collectively in dense areas together in a way that we can live well, live in a way that's healthy, secure, safe, equitable, and low carbon.
Okay. Healthy, secure, safe, equitable, and low carbon. That sounds. I had a lot of questions about why are we focusing on carbon, and we're clearly not, and that's huge, I would say. Are we also looking at the fact that we're breaking currently 6 out of the 9 boundaries? The only reason we aren't breaking the 7th is that the ocean is acting as a buffer. I am assuming that everybody involved in this is well aware of that. So is it, when we say we're looking at climate solutions, are we looking at ecosphere solutions? We're looking at the whole of humanity's relationship with the rest of the web of life, as well as the measurable data. Is that a question that makes sense within this context?
It does make sense. I'm not sure you're going to like my response in that. I don't think we're there yet. But
Okay.
but when we think about the mission at this point in time, and again, this is unprecedented in terms of
Sure.
who we need to get on board, not just
Yep.
in terms of the cities and meeting them where they are, because there is such a spectrum, but also those within the consortium who will come together to organize around prioritize what kind of expertise and support we can provide. And perhaps this is something I can get into a bit later, but there are kind of 3 core parts effectively at the moment of how we support cities. One is through a climate city contract, and through a pilot city program, and then there's also the broader platform support. And I think within that, especially as a starting point, again, because this hasn't been done before, we're really conscious, given how overloaded a number of municipalities are, a majority of them are, and the lack of capacity, to be providing support and a way forward that, we're not opening the box up too big.
Okay. All right. It's got to be practical, and you've got to see a route forward.
Absolutely. And I think through that route forward, there is an invitation. And I think depending on the city and the discussion, and we can also, I think, refer to the work we're doing directly at Shares Dark Matter Labs with Girona around what does a degrowth eco-social transition look like. That's where I think there is a huge scope for conversation, as there are in a number of cities who are mission cities, so within the 111, who are wanting to talk about Scope 3 emissions or wanting to talk about just transition and the broader web, and they're looking for that. And so that's part of, as a consortium, how are we ensuring that we're responding to that spectrum of need and those types of conversations.
Okay, so let's have a look at the cities and then begin to get some ideas of what's actually happening practically on the ground. 112 cities. Is it the case that that number could double or triple, or is this the number to which money is being sent and anyone who's interested can watch, but they're not going to get the funding? Are we limited to 112 between now and 2030, I suppose is the question.
No, we're not. And I laugh because so when this was first proposed as a mission, it was originally going to be 36 cities.
Wow. Okay.
And then I think there was over 376, I think, I will need to double check that, but however, almost 136 cities applied to be a mission city. So then it was expanded to 100.
Right.
And with the proposal that, yes, we're going to really work with this 112 in terms of getting the emission labels through the Climate City contract and all being entitled to a certain level of funding through the Pilot City program and also the platform support. But alongside that, there is a real push, not just from like a national platform perspective. So there are a number of countries already organizing and pairing the mission cities within their country with other cities.
Right.
And that's happening. It's really prevalent, particularly in the likes of Sweden and Spain are two really great examples of that. But also there is a push towards those who didn't make the 112 to have an opportunity for twinning. So we've got a twinning program that's already underway. So any city that's undergoing or advancing a pilot city program, for example, around retrofitting, and other cities see that of interest and it's a similar challenge, they will be paired. And so we're trying to do that simultaneously in the meantime, while also, if we look at the next couple of years, there is certainly an ambition to build out the portal that's used as the main platform so that anyone has access to the information and the learnings and the reflections, and long term for this to be scaled out from there.
Right. Brilliant. And so the twinning is happening within a nation? So within Spain, Valencia might be paired with other cities, or are they happening EU-wide across national boundaries as well?
EU-wide. Yeah,
Okay.
so the twinning program is actually EU-wide. And then we're also supporting cities in facilitating national platforms. So there is an organic level of sharing and twinning within a national context.
Right, because there's going to be linguistic barriers. If someone in Finland is paired with someone in Spain, they don't necessarily speak each other's languages, but anyone in Finland can link into a Finnish baseline and access all the data there. Is that the case?
That's the intention, yes. And we facilitate things like visits as well. So, I mean, it is interesting in a number of senses. One, in that, yes, if we think of cities as sandcastles, they've all got different configurations, but they're all made of sand.
Okay.
Same people, ambitions. There are similar challenges that keep coming up, but in slightly different contexts and slightly different pressures and forces. And, there's of course differences in power hierarchies and culture in terms of how decisions are made to a certain extent in different countries, or how challenging topics are even discussed or engaged with, or how folks mobilize. But when we think of the bread and butter or of the sand of each city, a number of the challenges are relatively similar, just on varying scales.
Okay, so let's have a look at what the challenges are. Is there a city with which you are particularly familiar? Can we narrow down to Valencia, say? I know you've been at a conference there. Or is there one that we could use as an exemplar and really explore what it's doing and assume that the others are on a similar pattern?
Yes, we can. I mean, I'm trying to think of what's a...
If that's a hard question, we could just generalize. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, I think there are a number. I've got examples of points of cities, but what I've got at the moment is examples of, as cities have gone through their climate city contract, for example, what they've highlighted some of their key challenges and what surfaced as a result of the climate city contract. I've also got examples around policy of key challenges that come up in the sticky bits there. But I guess I could also,
I don't want to push you into areas that are difficult. Let's just go with the climate city contract, what it is and what is coming up. Because I want to explore as much as we can the actual lived reality of this. What's happening for people who live in these cities? How is their life changing? How are the policymakers managing to engage the general people? Because it seems to me we just watched elections where the hard right, who are almost to a person climate deniers, are doing really well in Europe. And I wonder, it seems to me politically that if the climate cities take off and the people who live in those climate cities see real changes in how they live as a result of actions that are explicitly aiming to create a just transition to a more equitable and more regenerative, sustainable future, then that has political implications. And so I'm really curious to know what's actually being done and how it is being received and how it's being spread. So whatever route we can get into that, let's head down that route. If that feels like a generative route to you, I want to mine you for the most information we can get. So if there's a better way of getting to something that's alive for you in the moment, then go for it. Pretend I didn't answer the question you would like me to have asked.
Yeah, certainly. So I'll just start by saying that in organizing the city mission, there is the theory of collectively pulling together 112 cities to learn and through these various programs, but also more generally. There's also a learning process for the consortium in terms of, if we think about how cities have been socialized to date in terms of funding and working with the commission, it's usually there is amount of money, but there's also certain requirements or deliverables. And so if we think about taking a step back and thinking about the way of working as a starting point, I think that also needs to fundamentally shift. And that's part of, we're building the plane as we fly it, effectively. And that there are a number of partners, all of us who have been involved in previous EU Horizon projects, that have a certain sort of procedure in terms of deliverables and ways of thinking, and usually wanting a certain output. Okay. And we're also really aware when it comes to mission, we could meet the target but miss the point.
Right. Well done.
In terms of what does it mean to create a space to learn and potentially to fail if we actually want to meet the ambition of these cities being learning labs? And what is our role as a consortium in facilitating spaces for that, rather than being too top down and going, we need this from you in this form, which reflects the existing kind of socialization, perhaps, of the top down requirements.
Yeah. And so, the habit of ticking boxes. And then the boxes become the end point, and the climate is still disintegrating around us, but we ticked all the right boxes, so we're all okay. All right. So these are learning labs. What are we learning? So, let's go into that.
So when we think of, in that context, we look at the role of the Climate City Contract as a first example. Now, the Climate City Contract was born out of, actually inspired by the Swedish platform, Viable Cities, and basically the acknowledgement of 7 cities to start with, along with a number of ministries, that there is a need for genuine engagement and collaboration and long-term commitment between local, regional, and national level governments. Regardless of the political environment, what do we need to do to accelerate and amplify the climate transition? And how do we get specific on that and commit to each other a level of action that we can rely on? And so that manifested in contracts that I think started in 2019 or 2020, so that every year these cities come together and they draft a contract of what they're going to commit to each other as parties in advancing this climate transition. So I thought that would, and that's it. I wanted to just start with that because that formed part of the basis of the Net Zero City Climate City Contract, which has 3 parts. One is the commitments document, one is the action plan, and one is the investment plan. And now this isn't, again, another, static document that will ideally be gathering dust in 6 months. This was supposed to be used really as a tool, a governance tool, with the first part, with the commitments, being an opportunity for cities and horizontally, in terms of their citizens, private stakeholders, universities and whatnot, to come together and go, well, what are we committing to with each other? What is our shared vision of this city? Ideally, that goes beyond the politics. That goes, actually, what does it mean to live well? What do we want in terms of safety of our children and them growing up with clean air? And so what are the risks? What are the risks of not doing this? So acknowledging the risks of floods and with wildfires in the context of Greece, for example. And so the commitments document is one part of the Climate City Contract, was really used as a governance innovation tool. Basically means, can we use this as a way to get people in the room who perhaps haven't already got in the room to really share a vision of the city regardless of their political orientation, and what are they going to commit to?
Right. And so does this involve a lot of talking to the people who live in the city that probably haven't been asked what they want in a lot of previous political denominations? My assumption is that most cities have been quite top down, and that inquiries of the population, if they're anything like the UK, we'll ask and we'll gather all this data and then we will completely ignore it and do what we were going to do anyway. What I'm hearing from you is a genuine requirement and a need and a desire really to talk to as many people as possible and ask the question, what does it mean to live well? And then bring that back in and work out how to get there. Am I projecting my desires, or is this what's actually happening?
That's the theory, and in a number of cases that has been the practice. In a number of others, there is still a shift in the way of working required.
Okay.
Short answer to that. And so there are a number of cases where one of the first things City did is they went out and almost did, hey, what are you doing in the city already that it contributes to this common vision? Or they used the pulling together. So there are 4 windows in which they can submit this Climate City contract. And even though this contract is actually, it's a contract for the city, they then put it forward to the commission to get a mission label, mainly because they're to have a sense of integrity in terms of what numbers are they putting down in terms of their climate change emission, or their carbon emissions over time and things like that. And so there's an element of integrity and accountability required there. And so quite involved in the reviewing of that. But in a number of cases with that in mind and with that timeline, in a number of cases, it gave momentum to being able to mobilize workshops ahead of and in preparation of this Climate City contract, and particularly the commitments document, of which at the bottom of it, certain parties sign. Basically, they align to the contract. And I mean, again, this isn't a binding. As my background as a lawyer, I get a bit nervous about referring to something as a contract where it's technically not. But I think the sentiment is this isn't just a one-off. This is ideally an ongoing, updated, live document like it is in Sweden. But of course, there are some differences because we're trying to do this across 112 cities.
Yeah. Okay.
And that idea, the commitments document then foregrounds the action plan, which is effectively a snapshot in time of going, what are you doing already? And based on what the actions are already, and your main emissions profiles of key domains such as transport, stationary energy, so houses, like that, and also, other emissions.
Food, I would imagine.
Yes, waste. And with that in mind, looking at those key emission profiles, then going, hey, well, based on what your current trajectory of actions are, we're not looking to repeat anything here. What's the gap? What is the gap to decreasing your emissions to 80%? And then what are the actions, or what do you need to learn? What do you need to know to close that gap by 2030? So it's very kind of theory, you're allowing the system to see itself.
Right.
And that it's really wanting that kind of accountability and that awareness, because one thing I've noticed, we can often talk about wanting change and wanting to decrease emissions, but it's so intangible. It's really hard to go, yeah, but why what? Like, what is the context in which we sit?
Right.
And how do we then organize? And it was interesting talking to a German city as we were running through their Climate City contract, and them going, when we look clearly at our transport domain, we're going to have to decrease our emissions by 7-fold by 2030 if we're going to meet this target.
Right.
That suddenly there is a shift in mindset of going, what is necessary, and how do we communicate that collectively in order to rethink what it is we need to do?
Right. Right. Because that's one of the things that I was imagining. There are some obvious areas. So transport, housing, food, water, waste, and health. I wrote down without even thinking about it. This is not my domain, but those are obvious areas where our current way of operating has emissions and all kinds of other downstream effects. And it would, in the old way, be easy for, let's say, transport to go, well, nobody wants to stop driving their car. You guys are going to have to find savings elsewhere because transport is sacred and we're not going to touch it. What I'm hearing from you, or what I hope I'm hearing, is that these are self-selected cities. They want to meet their climate and carbon emissions and their overall, whatever we call, proper regeneration. They want to get there. They're prepared to make the changes that will take them there. I'm assuming they have fairly systems literate people engaging in this, because it seems to me in a lot of other areas, change happens one funeral at a time, and we don't have time for the old guard to die or retire. We have to bring in people who actually understand the systemic nature of things, and that the butterfly flaps its wings over here and the car stops over there, and that everything is everything else, and that you can't just make little individual tweaks, which you said somewhere near the top of the program. Are you finding that within the cities that are coming to you, that there are younger, more systemically aware people, or are the existing people educating themselves in systems thinking?
There is a mix.
Okay.
there is a mix. And if we look at the needs identification, it's one of the benefits of being at this scale, is being able to assess the typology of cities and needs and have common themes coming through. One is capacity and capability. And
What does that mean?
So capacity in terms of having those within the municipality having capacity to engage in the subject itself beyond their usual day-to-day administrative tasks, whether, for example, they're within like an environment team within the municipality or within a task force that's set up under the deputy mayor or mayor. And so there is a question with a number of cities of trying to increase the capacity of a number of those within a certain team or across teams, ideally, so that we can engage in this. Because again, if we think back to this being a really unprecedented approach, this isn't a climate project. This isn't another EU Horizon project. It's literally seeking a shift in institutional operating and a way of thinking. And so depending on the city, a number of them, including the German city I mentioned before, at the time they were writing the Climate City contract, they were also part of a huge organizational restructure because they observed that actually they couldn't do the work they needed to and engage in it properly without doing so. They were assigning 1 to 2 people actually to sit across departments to ensure there was a cross-fertilization of knowledge.
Brilliant.
So that's what I mean by, but that's really tough because there are also a number of brilliant individuals I've talked to who have worked really hard on building these CCCs, and it's on the side of the desk. It's what they're doing because they're really passionate about, but it isn't necessarily part of therefore, they joke it's like their part-time job plus.
Right.
Something.
Okay. So they don't have the time and the bandwidth to do this unless they're given it by the structure within which they work. Wow. Are they finding these amazing individuals who really get it? Are they able to go to somebody further up the food chain and say, you need to free me up from my existing job so that I can do this? Is that happening to a greater extent?
I would say so because we've got some great CCCs out of it, but I don't think that's always the case. And I think there's also a huge amount of work as well in terms of bringing in those from other departments to engage, to make this truly a cross-department sort of effort. And that is really mixed within the cities.
But are they learning from each other? You had a conference recently in Valencia. Are people able to see that in some places things are really racing and working, and in other places they're getting stuck, presumably just by structural, rigid, hierarchical systems that need to learn to be more fluid, which is hard.
Yes.
You've got certain people, the people who are there, the people who like working like that, the people who wanted it more fluid will have left by now.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are 2 things there. One is reflecting on how individuals interact when there is, because within a municipality, within any political environment, you've got the administrative and then you've got the political. And those who are there who really are there to deliver on the existing sort of administrative structure of tasks, and it's more the interpretation and implementation rather than creation, so to speak. Although there's a bit of that. And then there's the political side, and how much do they connect? And then is having a strong political mandate, but a slow or not as engaged administrative, how does that limit the ability to engage in work like this and vice versa? And we're seeing, it comes down to the individuals as to how you succeed. And I think the second thing I would just add on that, and perhaps this is a bit of a segue, is part of the work we're really proposing within Net Zero Cities is this idea of using social innovation principles or systemic thinking, and that basically underpins everything we do, everything around the support we provide. And so, one thing in particular we propose as part of this, in order for cities to sustain this effort over time and support themselves, we propose creating transition teams. And this is, again, built off inspiration of what's been done previously by brilliant teams in cities around Europe and elsewhere. And it's asking, okay, well, what are archetypes of transition teams that build a backbone for Emission and a way of working differently? And so in a number of cases, it is setting up a task force that sits under the mayor. And it has relationships, it's ideally not just cross-department, but also engaging with the private sector, citizen groups, universities and whatnot, and building a broader city coalition. And so one thing we really propose is, okay, how are you creating your transition team? So it's not just one or two people within the environment department.
Right.
We've got brilliant examples of that. And that's also reflected back in the first part of the action plan. That's going, okay, well, how are you organizing? What's your organizational chart? How do you go about even pulling and preparing this CCC such that you can then understand what actions are necessary?
Remind us what a CCC is, because you mentioned it a few times and I've already lost track.
So the Climate City Contract.
Okay, fine. Thank you. You've said it several times. I realized that. My brain is missing. There's so much to get into, because it seems to me that, as with almost everything else that we talk about in the podcast, it comes down to interpersonal reactions and relations and people's capacity to do the inner work that lets them be a little bit more flexible and not get as triggered in interpersonal interactions, so that they are more able to say yes at the appropriate times. Are you finding that people are building, I don't know what we'd call it, emotional resilience networks with each other to share best practice of how actually to become the kind of person who can step forward into the world and make this happen? Because it seems to me it's a very different skill set to, say, being on the city council 20 years ago. It's a new way of being as a human being and as a political governance operator.
I agree. It is something we talk about a fair bit. How do we create spaces for this capacity? I don't think that's something that we've necessarily, I wouldn't say we haven't done well to date, but it isn't something that necessarily sits within the kind of technical expertise provision of a.
Okay.
But it's something that it's really prevalent in most conversations. It is interpersonal, and I guess the question is, when we talk about building capacity and capability, actually capability, like a huge part of that, I would propose, and this is just my view, is that very much needs to be around the human, the awareness of how we show up in this and our role in this. And if I can reflect on that a bit more, because when we think of missions, like why are we even calling it a mission? It's because it's something we haven't done before. We're having to go beyond what we think is possible. And how do we create safe spaces for us to do that, knowing we may fail? And if we, so I think that at the very essence of creating environments for missions and for innovation requires vulnerability. It requires failing at a time in which those who are trying to move this along don't feel like there's any space to do so.
Right.
Really. And because especially if you think at a city level, it is tough, because you don't always necessarily have the funding and you don't necessarily always have the power. And so these cities are holding these mandates and this vision and this ambition to get to climate neutrality by 2030. They probably have control, I think, based on the economic cases we've done to date, on about 10% of those emissions within the city. Yeah.
So when your transport guy in Germany, or people in Germany, say that they need to reduce by 700%, they don't have control of how that happens necessarily.
Not necessarily. So this is the part in that. This is the key part in going, okay, well, as a mission, as like the mission steward and building a transition team, what is ours to do as orchestrators in terms of highlighting the path? Because I also think there is a default mechanism of, unless we know how to do it and we can set a clear sort of trajectory ourselves and we can do it ourselves and we have direct control over it, it can't happen. And so I think there's also a real role in, how do we orchestrate? How do we get really clear on what is needed? And then how we build in those relationships, both horizontally in terms of within our city and vertically in terms of the ministries and regional councils, to understand what is their role, how can we work together on this common objective. And so there's a really key orchestration role there, while the default is still, what can we only hold and carry? And it's just too much.
Yeah, I can imagine. It feels like the potential for burnout is huge. And the governance of a particular city can be really committed to this now, but city governance is open to political change. And so, for instance, Bristol, I know Bristol is one of the cities, and they currently have a Green Council. But it's possible that that council might be voted out in 4 years and Reform might own the council instead, and then everything falls apart. And knowing that that's the case, knowing that you not only have to have a broad, wide, long vision of what do we want to achieve by 2050, we have to maintain a narrative of inclusivity, just transition, and we are doing good things for the people of our city now so that you don't get voted out at the next election. And juggling that must be quite hard.
Absolutely. It is interesting in that this is, I think, one of the main reasons why we've really tried to emphasize and support cities in going, how do you build these transition teams and embed the vision?
Right.
Because we have had a number of cities already who have submitted their CCCs, brilliant visions, they've got great sort of citizen engagement, really impressive sort of views. For example, a number of Spanish cities talked about what's a Mediterranean way of transitioning, what is in the essence of who we are, like beautiful. Right. And then a change in there and very different priorities. And so I think it's not just a nice to have for citizen engagement and horizontal embedded this in this a shared vision. It is a need to have.
It's essential. Yeah.
And getting clear on what are the core elements of what it means to live together, regardless of political orientation. And let's get clear on that so that, of course, I think with the shift in political tide, there is often a variance in how we get there. But I think if we can at least be clear on where we need to get to and why, and ensure that those messages are salient and aligned,
yeah,
I think that also allows for a far more informed discussion at a political level of the how, perhaps. But that's just my...
Yeah, no. That makes a lot of sense. I would love to talk about specifics, but I'm guessing that would be quite hard. Alrighty. So let's move away from politics and policy and begin to look in more depth at what actually can happen on the ground, at the kinds of things that cities can do in logistical terms to begin to become more regenerative, to begin to move people to where we all need to be if we're going to make it through the meta crisis. Because this sounds to me like this is where we're all heading. If I'm wrong, you can tell me. But let's have a look at the detail. Let's have a look at what's actually happening on the ground. Over to you.
Sure. So I can speak to. I would love to give an example of one city in particular that, in going through the process of preparing its climate city contract and action commitments, action plan, and investment plan, got a real insight into tangibly how it's navigating not only the establishment of its vision as a city, but also what the practical sort of actions they're trying to take, not just in like a laundry list, but almost designing in something really process like a portfolio of actions. How are you building synergies within these actions over time and acknowledging where those synergies align, not necessarily just within domains, but across domain too. And so there's a city in particular in Greece, which is brilliant in that in proposing this climate city contract, it didn't necessarily actually make it all about being green or being, look, I wasn't explicit about the carbon reduction. It was explicit on identifying kind of the four transformation path that it saw the city being on. And they were based on it being a good city to live in, to properly live in. A low emissions mobility, the second pathway. The third was a city to produce and create. And the fourth is a city that learns.
Right.
And so that's how they organize, not only come together in their commitments, but also then how they organize the series, like the actions, the portfolio of them, and therefore then at the investment plan stage, how are we going to fund this and what are the co-benefits? Who's benefiting from these transition pathways on the whole? And who can we bring on that journey?
Right.
And so with a city to live in, again, the number of these actions weren't explicit sort of, we are going to decarbonize X. It was, what are we doing already? How do we make the city better to live in? That also happens to be decarbonized.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
And so there was, for example, key actions around the regeneration of urban spaces and urban areas. there was
Regeneration being what? What does that mean?
upgrading of urban areas of how they engage in common and public spaces, including the aesthetics and functional upgrading of public spaces. So are people proud to live and exist and coexist and share space?
Right. Right.
Because if you've got an ability to share space and really enjoy being in common or public areas together, that also is one of the many bridges that needs to be built in terms of their understanding how they share that vision of looking after that space together. And so along with that, by taking a real focus, and it feels quite simple, but a focus on the aesthetics and the functional upgrading in a way that was low carbon, they also then motivated seeing the city as a clean city and one people could take pride in.
Right. Right. And
then,
in terms of we're not covered in smoke and we don't have sewage flowing in the rivers, but also, and we're picking up our litter, I guess, but clean in terms of clean lines, clean ways of connecting. What does clean mean? Go more deeply into clean for us, please.
Yeah, sure. So my understanding based on the discussions with the city was, yes, it was in terms of being able to connect between public spaces, being able to get places easily in a way that was, that there, and I think it was probably that, but also things like access to, access to public spaces that were well looked after and well maintained. I think particularly in a city in Greece where it's really, really hot, having places that are almost refuges was also really important. It sounds, actually, I think when I reflect back on conversations, it was quite functional to a certain extent in terms of, do you feel proud to be part of this space and look after it yourself? It's that kind of broken glass theory of you don't treat the place well, or there's more likely for crime to happen in places where there's broken glass and rubbish.
Right.
So basic stuff like that, right through to then, how do you take pride in your street?
Okay.
And how much do you spend time in your street? And then I think that also invites a conversation, not explicitly, we can move to this in a second, but in terms of then who's taking up the most space in the street. If you enjoy being in the street, then you're perhaps more likely to identify as a private vehicle that's taking a majority of the parking space and then the road, or that a space you would also like to gather in.
Right. Yes. And then this moves to stuff that Rob Hopkins was talking about, where people just kind of painted lines on the street and went, okay, now we have a square and you're not allowed to bring your cars in here because we want our kids to be able to kick balls around safely. And then you begin to build that sense of community that a lot of our cities have lost because of our fragmentation and isolation, individuation. Is this something that they've identified, or is this something that's actually happening? Are we seeing changes in the city as a result of this? Do you know?
My understanding is that there are changes, the functional changes, so it doesn't feel that obvious and that in the face in terms of we're doing this because it's a good green thing to do.
Sure.
It's the subtle shift that are more like that they know they can get through, that are also building the momentum and the engagement in that place.
Brilliant. Okay.
So
All right.
I think just a slight deviation on this, but I think this is a really important sort of example, I think, that we can be taking elsewhere in thinking about, using Rob Hopkins' example is we don't always need to think about the stick or the hard power in terms of going, let's stop this being, a through road and let's put some barriers up and make it a park. It's, or how do we pedestrianize streets? It's going, well, how do we make it easier to socialize a different way of operating in this space? And that might mean, for example, making it really easy to consent day-long festivals or, food markets or, the cyclovias we had in Colombia, or cycling days. It's how do you, over time, shift a way of relating to a space and then keeping it clean, making it functional such that there is an ability to imagine a different way of using the space. And there is therefore a mandate to then make that more permanent. And in the meantime, there's also simultaneously a reflection of those who used it in perhaps the old way. All right, well, what do they need? What are their drivers in order to, in that transition, if there are things that they still need to facilitate that? So if it's pedestrianizing a street where there are those who need car access, what are alternatives that we can explore so that when we do make this permanent, they're not ostracized?
Right. So we've got that radical inclusivity and the just transition that doesn't marginalize anybody for the sake of it. And presumably that then feeds into what is the entire transport mechanism and policy for the city, and how can we shift it so that people don't need their cars anymore within a specific zone? Is this heading towards the concept of 15-minute cities, which has become a bit of a third rail, as far as I can tell? But if it wasn't called that, are we heading towards that as a concept?
Yes, I do think there is real merit in that framing, in that, and it's actually something a friend of mine mentioned previously and referred to as being a destabilizer, a destabilizing sort of demonstrator. And what I mean by that is it destabilizes a way of seeing the world or way of existing within a space. And by suddenly going, wait, I can get what I need without having to jump in a car, suddenly that shifts the paradigm of how do I move and how do I relate to this space and what am I benefiting from as a result of clean air and being able to bike 2 blocks to get to the bakery.
Yeah. Yes. And all of the work that I've seen on people living in, particularly in Paris in the 15-minute areas, is that there may have been pushback and hostility to start with, but once it's happening, everybody seems to enjoy it, or at least everybody who's asked seems to enjoy it. Let's move on with your city. That you said there were a number of things that they were doing. So creating that sense of any public spaces being more communal, more accessible, more fun to be in was one thing. What else have they done? What else is working?
Yeah, so under the heading of a city to live in, they also were talking about housing in particular, right? So how do we lower the basic goal? I think the first thing they usually say is what's the cost?
Sure.
Because how do we lower the cost, especially in the last year or two with the turbulence and gas prices? But how do we make houses that are cleaner, that have lower costs, but also are just warmer or cooler and safer? And so there is a fair bit of work going into even like the digital twinning, and there are other ways in which you can start understanding and blueprinting what are the kinds of houses within, you're usually pretty similar. And I can actually speak to another example of this in another country as well, where they're setting blueprints and looking at what are the 4 sort of archetypes of houses, setting blueprints of what does retrofitting look like for these houses, and let's experiment and pilot, then we can scale.
Okay. And that's actually happening?
Happening, yes. Okay. Yes, in Poland. Yeah, there's they're collectively working together. It's one of the pilot programs. Actually, you can find a number of the pilot programs. They're all detailed on the Net Zero City website.
Okay.
For learning. And yeah, but this here, I'm not going to jump too much into specifics on this because I know we've got a few more to go through, but yes, looking at as a city to live in, as a heading, as a transformative pathway, but also as an organizing sort of has an organizing function of asking citizens in terms of your housing, what does it mean for this to be one that you can live in and feel proud to live in? Okay. What do you need in terms of housing? And the same for sports and education. And so those are the other kind of key actions within that pathway of a city to live in. Was your access to sports? Was your access to education? Where and how are you feeling access to that?
Can I ask very briefly? I've been listening to Zach Stein quite a lot recently, and he's got some very radical ideas on cities where the point of the city is to educate the youth, and going right back upstream of what is humanity for, and suppose we posited that humanity was for creating better humans. That's what we're here for. And what is a better human? And that the young generations have a sense of being and belonging and agency and connectedness. And then what if the entire city or town was devolved to finding ways of helping the young people become that? And you don't need schools anymore then, because everybody is learning everywhere. And we come back much more to tribal concept of the older people and the younger people are there with the older people teaching the younger people, and the people in the middle are creating the food and the shelter and making it possible for the older people to help the younger people to evolve. And that struck me as that's probably beyond 2050. But is there anybody in terms of education in any of the net zero cities looking at why are we putting kids in schools? What are schools for? What is education for? Is that becoming a part of the conversation?
It's a beautiful question. I don't but this is just, I'm part of a very small view
Okay.
into the consortium, but my view at the moment, I can't see that necessarily being part of the conversation within net zero cities. I
Okay.
think as part of other circles, it's very much a conversation we're having.
Okay.
But at a city level at the moment, no. But I have to say the city, the deputy mayor actually who wrote it, again, on Fiver's desk, he wrote basically all of this action plan. He's
Wow.
brilliant. He's got a PhD in physics, actually. He's absolutely amazing. We really wanted to use projects like a green school. So again, not quite at your point of what do we need a school for in the existence of or how we coexist as humans, but he really wanted, like, what does it mean to fund and develop a number of green schools within the city as demonstrators then of the blocks around them, in terms of how do we keep everyone getting to and from the school, and it demonstrated more generally of how the city could operate differently.
Wow. Wow. I need to, yes, Jenny Gretve is coming back on the podcast. She has been commissioned to design a donut school in Denmark, as in a donut economics school. And it seems to me that that should be feeding into this somewhere, because it's almost the same thing and would be very exciting. Probably we'll have an education podcast at some point separately. Okay, so sports and education, housing, public spaces, transport. Take us further on with the blueprints in this city.
Sure. So there's the second of the 4 transformation kind of paths that were, or impact pathways that were identified, was as a low emission mobility space. And so there are a couple of key aspects to that. One is around how do we create and build or further sustainable urban mobility infrastructure. So it's getting really specific and understanding what are the movements within the city. And of course, within the peri-urban.
On the roads. This isn't social mobility. This is getting from A to B, getting to your place of work, getting to school, getting to the hospital. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So understanding the movements better to understand what are the needs and how are people currently moving in terms of anything from multimodal, so walking and cycling through to motorbikes or private vehicles or trains or buses.
Right.
And so understanding the movements to go, how do we shift this over time? What infrastructure is missing that we need to introduce to enable a greater shift in multimodal travel from private vehicles to public infrastructure or public transport? And I think for the number of these cities that are perhaps they do have a large proportion of commuters coming in, because they usually have the one of the main cities within their region. And so also getting a sense of, for those coming from the peri-urban, how are we ensuring that even though this is an action plan within a city, it's very much connected to its region and border area, and that those needs of those who sit perhaps just outside the boundary.
Right. Yes, because if you spend all of your working life in the city, you're essentially still a part of the city, and you're going to then spend quite a lot of your leisure time in the place that you know. When we talk to the transport people, it seems that the view of public transport is shifting from a kind of 19th century model of let's pile all the people in a cart, and it's either a cart on rails or it's a cart on wheels, it's a bus or a train or a tram, and moving instead to, we live in the era of AI and at least partially self-driving cars, and it should be possible for me to go onto an app that is perhaps not Uber but is collectively owned, of which I own a part, and say, I need to be in town for a dental appointment by 3:00. Get me there. And the AI does all of the logistics and picks up perhaps 7 people on its route past me in the village, all of whom need to get into the local town for a certain time, and it drops us off on the way. And then within 10 minutes of me leaving the dentist, I can go, okay, I would like to be at another small town to do a bit of shopping, and then I'd like to be home. And the AI, this is one of the things that AI is really good at, is basically data manipulation. And it can work, and there's roadworks happening on the A49, so we need to go a slightly different route, and that means we can pick up somebody else or drop somebody else off. AI is really good at this, and it transforms our concept of, I live in a village where there's probably 3 buses a week that come through, and it's just not useful, so nobody's on them, so they're a complete waste of time. And even in cities, there must be effective public transport and not effective public transport. So again, this is just really a question of, as people are thinking forward, are they thinking into the world that is coming, or are they still working out how to make electric trams go along certain routes?
So in this case, I think there was certainly more a case of getting a sense of what the movements were and then proposing alternatives in terms of what's missing in terms of infrastructure. But a really interesting conversation I had with an Italian city in Valencia a few weeks ago was looking at actually how do we get not quite what you were saying, but not far off in terms of exploring at a neighborhood level, what does it need to have almost like capsule, almost capsule like sort of transit kind of connect to each other as they come along or shoot off, disconnect from each other between neighborhoods together and organized in a way that provide a slightly more what would you say?
It's like modular public transport, basically.
Modular public transport, yeah. So it's like more independent, or you have a bit more control over where you go. And I think that's still in the works, but there is certainly an interest in that, and that is certainly underway. I'll see if I can find a link to it. I think they're still in the early stages of that, but that really piqued my interest. I think a number of us in the room were like, can we just stop every other conversation and continue with this one?
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
That's it, right? Because I do think when we think about transport itself, we also, as we talked about before, also need to continually think about how it exists within that broader context in terms of why are we moving within a city.
Right.
And, with the 15-minute city, what does it look like to have a place near where you live, where you can co-work 2 days a week? What is the purpose for moving into the city? Those sorts of questions of how do we exist within this space, and therefore why do we need to move, and the best way to do that. And I guess that I think that's ideally one of the questions I'd love to be asking, because then that, instead of going down the road of how do we problem solve with this distinct challenge around we probably need to decarbonize transport, it gets very narrow very quickly, rather than asking the question, how do we move better in a way that's equitable and safe and acceptable?
And potentially move less, because I remember talking to Rob Percival, he brought some Indigenous people to the UK, and he said one of the things that they never got their head around was this bizarre idea that you would get in any kind of vehicle and go an hour away from where you lived, leave your family and everything that mattered behind in order to do a job that you didn't enjoy and not make community there, and then come back again. And he said it just never computed at all. And it does seem to me, from what I understand of 15-minute cities, that, guys, we could live and work in a community where everything happens in the same space. We don't need to take you to a factory that's an hour away from where you live anymore. That's 18th century, 19th century thinking, and 21st century thinking is different. So this is more what's happening in this overall thinking, is how do we help people live and work in the same space? Is that part of it?
These are part of the broader questions. I wouldn't necessarily say that they hit that within this particular city to that extent in terms of how do we move. I don't think we got to that point, but very much on that track of going, what do we need to understand about the needs in order to shift infrastructure? But it's a bit more specific in terms of what infrastructure could we do tomorrow, or could we fund? And then for example, what's the role of freight? How does freight move within a city in terms of, the industrial uses? And then how do we also understand that and work with private sector to think about how we might do that differently?
Wow. Okay, that would be a podcast all in its own right. Let's move on then. What else are they thinking about in this city?
So the third pathway that they focused on was a city to produce and create.
Right.
Now, this is a city that, also relies a lot on the agricultural sector, and not many do. And so this was quite interesting in that there was a real reflection. One of the key actions was around how do we support the agricultural sector to reduce emissions over time. And this was fun because, again, when we think about these climate city contracts, we're also thinking about those who wrote them and their perspective, and there are those who perhaps are more technical and want to look for the technical solutions, and those who are also as well looking for the more systemic. But what I really loved about this example, that they'd literally proposed and done, think like an investment plan or like a specific sort of profiling of how much it would cost, was how to pitch the substitution of like fuel-based, like diesel-fueled tractors to electric tractors for the farm. And literally, like, the amount of tracks they need to replace, like, it got to that level of specificity.
Well done.
And how they could pitch over time, because of the fluctuations in fuel prices, how actually it was better off for the farmers over a 5 to 7 year period as a result of investing in this. It was brilliant. So just really practical. How do we go about just not putting this big vision out there, but then feeling like everything you have to do to get towards that as if it's being hard. It's like, no, we've pitched it for you. This is how we can see it happening. It's going to be of great interest to you too. Let's go.
Yes, because if you can show people the pathways, they'll go. It's when they think it's not possible because they can't see how it can be done. That's amazing. And I'm thinking of when we talked with Simon Michaud, his vision of 2030, 2050 is that we're all going to have to be living much more locally, and we're all going to need to eat food that's been grown within a not very huge radius, because we can't afford to be in a 6-continent just-in-time supply chain and shipping stuff from New Zealand to the UK. It's just, that's insane. And how do we all eat from, so that kind of concept of we've already done the arithmetic, we've already worked out the logistics of how to create a radius around our city where people are presumably not only using electric tractors, but perhaps moving towards regenerative farming where there's far fewer monocultures, far less ploughing and mechanical interventions happening, and we're moving towards regenerative thinking. Is that happening, or is that too far off on the margins?
I think that's probably one step further than when I got to here. But I'd also wonder if there is, with other cities we've looked at, they haven't usually, like, there is quite a distinct sort of boundary, right? So there isn't necessarily that discussion. But I also think with the other missions, so for example, the adaptation mission, which is, and then the soils mission, and again, these are distinct, but that they're also intertwined, and we're working really hard to make sure that we're also working with those other missions.
Okay,
because
everyone's talking to everybody else.
Yeah, that very much, we're extremely trying to do so. But I do think when we think of the soils and adaptation, I really hope that this is becoming more and more prevalent.
Right.
And actually,
that will feed in.
Yes. But again, I think when you're sort of seeking a different way of operating and observing and trying to navigate a problem, a solution space, you also need to put in boundaries at some point in order to get.
Yes, or it all becomes too big and overwhelming.
Yeah.
But
then those boundaries are, of course, arbitrary. And
they need to be allowed to dissolve at the point when it's appropriate. And at some point, presumably, maybe this already exists, you need the kind of vision for, okay, let's assume that all of the cities have achieved what they want to achieve by 2030. Then what's the next step? And then it might be, we want everybody to be eating food that can be brought in within an hour by appropriate transport from the surrounding area. What does your surrounding area look like? What could grow there? What do you need to share with other cities? And what can you supply yourself from your own area? Which would apply, I'm guessing, to housing and health, as well as to food.
Yeah, I can actually, after we finish off, I can actually give you an example of a policy that we're proposing right now with a Dutch city literally looking at food. And with these questions in mind,
Well, do it now. Do it just quickly now, and then we'll go back to number 4 in the Greek city. Tell us about that, because we'll forget otherwise.
Sure. So I think a Dutch city is very much looking at, like, one of their sort of organizing principles, or one of their propositions, is a plant-based treaty, and the question is, how do we move from consuming around like 40% plant-based protein right now, 60% by 2030.
Right.
Okay. And again, there's some nuance required here, because plant-based can be monocrop. We've got to be really careful.
And it could be shipped in from Brazil, and we took down half a rainforest to make it happen, and that's not a good thing. So yeah.
Exactly. So I think in proposing the sort of the sort of ambition, of course, like anything, there needs to be a number of requirements about what we mean by that, and what does a quality output look like in order to meet this.
Yes. And what's the nutrient value of the food that we're growing, and how are we growing it? And because we're understanding a lot more about the microbiome now, and about different ways of creating things. So a pint of milk and a pint of milk are not the same depending on where they arose from in terms of their nutrient qualities. And that would then feed into the mission on cancer, because a lot of what we eat is causing a lot of our internal chaos. Gosh, there are so many things. All right, let's step back from that. Let's go back to what's number 4 on the Greek city.
Yeah, sure. So I think what's fun, number 3, just to finish off. So
yes.
a city that's produce and create. So looking at agricultural sector. So really understanding how do we help with engaging in and exciting the livelihoods of those who live here and how they produce and how they create. That also includes manufacturing and crafts.
I was going to say, is it beauty as well? Right. We create beautiful things as well as useful things.
Exactly. Absolutely. And how do we enable that? And then how do we also enable that through, they talk about the energy upgrading of buildings and facilities for the tertiary sector, and also energy production and distribution. So again, what we're seeing here is, and it is actually quite prevalent in a number of cities, is they're focusing on retrofitting for the buildings within their control, because of course they own it, and it's more because they're funding it. It's really hard when it comes to privately owned buildings.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's another point, but that's something that's coming up a lot, and how different cities are navigating that. But then we get to the fourth one, which is a city that learns, which I love.
Yes.
Is how do they facilitate an environment where they're piloting and researching activities to move forward and advance these first 3 impact pathways, for example. And what are the research and innovation structures, and how are they, through like information and awareness campaigns, also empowering citizens to be more involved and engaged in these discussions and taking more ownership of them.
Right.
So I thought that was beautiful, because often I hadn't actually seen before this an impact pathway of a city that was just focused on learning.
Yeah. And every level of learning.
Exactly.
And yes, how do we do it? How do we help people to learn more, and how do we help them to teach each other? And that then moves again into education of the children, presumably.
Exactly. And so that's where, yeah, exactly.
Wow. How long has this particular vision and model been around? Is it just in the development stage, or is it going down the line a bit?
So this was submitted September last year.
Okay, right. So it's very new. So you and I need to have a conversation about 2 years' time to find out where it's got to.
Yeah, I do think, Manda, on a number of things, we can highlight certain challenges and opportunities now, but as you say, like there is so much of just being in the trenches and just crafting and the awkward, not quite knowing. Because I do think with these climate city contracts too, they're brilliant in that we really encourage cities to highlight what we don't know, what don't you know, and so that there can be a facilitation of support, but also an acknowledgement of the journey ahead. It isn't supposed to be a PR piece. It's supposed to be a snapshot of a point in time.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we find out that every city has something they don't know that is the same, because otherwise I don't know A, but you do know A and I know B and you don't, and we work together and we can help you fill in the gaps and you can fill in my gaps. But if there's something that everybody doesn't know, then presumably that you can then posit, if 112 cities, none of them knows whatever X is, then it's quite likely that every city in Europe doesn't know this. And then we can get people together and go, okay, this is quite serious and we need to fill in this gap, or decide that it's a gap that never needs to be filled because it's obsolete. Is that kind of data collection being done? And do you know of any things that are turning up that are universal?
Yeah, so that's one of the key roles of taking of the consortia coming together, is the orchestrating of and connecting of key pieces and missing pieces.
Right.
And we're really fortunate in that we're led by brilliant guy Thomas Osterbar, who's been in the game of working with cities and their transitions for 30 plus years. So it's brilliant in that there are ideas that come up or challenges that that they're perennial, right? And there are ones that he just goes, I've heard this before, this is what we did, or this is perhaps a cultural challenge rather than a technical challenge, so there is a real pragmatism. He's brilliant. But to your question, yes, so there are questions. I think there are a number of challenges that surface, but then often not specific enough. And so what we're getting to now is, as with these conversations are maturing and we're going, well, we've got support. What do you mean by there being a challenge in terms of financing certain infrastructure? And so one thing we've done is last year or two, we've set up, colleagues at Bankers Without Boundaries have set up the Mission Cities Capital Hub. Yeah, I laughed at the name too. Basically, it's that I
Sounds
think
good, though.
I think they were going for Bankers Without Borders, like Doctors Without Borders, and then
Right.
I've already had that name. But I think they're pitching for Better World Banking or Bankers Without Bonuses or something instead. But Bankers Without Boundaries, but they're great. But they're, along with a number of other partners, have set up the Capital Hub, which is really a space to facilitate private investment. And so it's going actually helping cities go, well, if we actually can only fund probably 15 or so to 20%, if that, of what's needed to be funded within a city, who else is going to fund the rest? Is it a combination of EU funding, of national funding? But a lot of it, of course, is going to come from the private sector, especially when you consider that, as I mentioned before, like 90+%, I mean, it depends on the city, but on average, 90+% of the assets that within a city that are emitting carbon, they're not owned by the public sector,
Right.
or by the public authority. There isn't that control. And so there is going to be a huge amount of investment needed by the private sector. And so how do you go about coordinating and governing those arrangements? And so the Capital Hub was a response to that, to go, well, how do we help you? And this is also the investment plan that was surfaced. These challenges were surfaced through the investment plan part, because once you've set out your actions and the gaps, and the investment stage, it's going, well, how do we fund this? And it's really as to exactly what we mean and what's missing, what are the challenges. Key challenge that kept coming up for a number of cities was debt ceilings. So their inability
ceilings.
Ceilings. Yeah, sorry, my Kiwi accent.
So they can't. No. I was just wondering what debt ceiling is. That's we can't possibly borrow more money because we've hit a hard stop on what's allowed.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, in response to that, as part of the platform, we're organising a policy lab with a number of cities from 2 countries in particular that have highlighted this as a challenge, to go, okay, let's sit down and get really specific as to what you mean by that. And how can we coordinate, not just at a city level, but working at that multi-level negotiations. Who did we talking to at a regional and national level to get really clear on exactly what the implications of not fixing this are, or not finding a workaround are, and how do we go about creating a way to move through this?
Because if we can prove to whatever is the governing body at the top that it's going to cost more to not fix this than if you give the actual capital to fix it, then presumably there's more of an incentive for the capital to arrive. With public versus private funding, you and I have both been through Schumacher. We possibly took different things from it, but that's a separate conversation. I still get very nervous about the idea that anything that is a public good is being used as a source of revenue for private investment. They want their interest, and that's how we get to an economy that has to grow. Are there private investors who are prepared to invest without seeing huge extraction of value from the system?
I would like to think so. I'm not on the front lines of that, but from conversations, I do believe there are. But I think this is a really important point in terms of looking at supporting cities and facilitating a level of private capital, like the expectations, the terms in which that is set is critical. And particularly, we often look at PPPs being a case of, socializing the risks and privatizing the benefits.
Yes, exactly.
We've seen that happen time and time again. And I do get nervous thinking about this pressure to need to invest now, need to move things along quickly, usually follows with, let's do the same thing we've always done. And there is a real fear because of how PPPs or private public partnerships haven't worked out previously, or how, for example, councils have then been sued, or there's been, there have been I think there are a number of cases for councils where they're really nervous of negotiating a different kind of arrangement with the private sector. We've also seen cases where there is some sort of a joint venture, or like a common vehicle, actual vehicle, where there is an agreement on a certain amount of contribution from a number of parties that's then governed or convened for the purposes, for example, of like a green energy district or a positive energy district or whatever. But I think one of the real challenges we're seeing coming up is, how do we govern that? How do we govern differently in a way that holds that accountability? And ideally, if we think back to also a just transition, holding the public good and the common good for the benefit of the city.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think, especially at Dark Matter Labs and with a number of colleagues, we talk about a lot. But I think that also these are the conversations that also take time and take capability, capacity building, and confidence building as well.
Because this is cultural change. This is, if we're going for life ennobling economics rather than just extractive economics, it's a complete different shift, and there will be structures of brown envelopes packed with cash that exist within cities of, we will give you this contract, you will provide me with a holiday home in Marbella. I don't know. But those kinds of understandings have to dissolve, and that presumably is a cultural shift that could take a while.
It couldn't. And I do wonder to what extent this comes back to being grounded in something like a transition team, or what is the backbone of this transition, and then holding integrity to the vision, not just of the what and the why, but the how.
Yeah.
And what are those values that are shared in a city in terms of how we get there? And what is the role, for example, of blockchain and reflecting what those commitments are? Like, if I think of like taking my zero city hat off for a second, I mean, like imagine using something like that to then have full transparency around certain decisions or commitments. Like I think there is a way to play and use that in a way that is accessible and open.
Fantastic. Oh gosh, it's so exciting. Alrighty, I'm aware that we're running out of time and we've gone through a lot. Is there anything else that you would like to share that's really alive for you at the moment and that you think is making a difference?
Yeah, I think two things. One, probably more practical in terms of my role in policy. I think it's really important to first just kind of frame what we mean, because I think it's a word that I'm often reminded by my colleague Tom that means everything and nothing. But I think it plays a really important role in how we navigate this transition. And I think the point I probably ended with is just one around the more psychological or emotional of what does it mean to belong within this transition. And so from a policy perspective, what I'm really trying to advocate for in terms of our support with cities is understanding the extent of power that they do have. When you think of policy, I think of it as this black box of decision-making, people and power, basically. If we're here, really simple. It's effectively it. And so it's understanding policy then manifests, like it's public authority's power. It's effectively the right to, the legitimate use of force and legitimate use of funding. Effectively, we like to boil it right back.
Back to Hobbes and the nation state, but this is on a city level. Yeah. Okay.
But at a regional and national level too. So then it goes, well, what's within our toolbox? How do we leverage that in a way that really advances this vision, in a way that has a mandate to do so? And so what's really interesting about the mission is that it's asking, what Mazzucato has often proposed is, it's asking cities to move, or public authorities, usually at a national level, but also regional and city, from being market fixing. So basically sitting back and going, we'll fix problems as they go wrong, but we'll let the market decide, to being market shaping and market creating. Right. And so that means being influential and going, well, actually the rules of the game are really tilted in one direction. So right now it costs nothing to pollute. It costs nothing if your business relies on plastic, and that goes straight into the, there's no stewardship around how, there's not much of a social license really to operate. And so it's asking, well, in order to be market shaping and market creating, or I would go a step further and go city shaping, it's going, well, what are the rules of the game? What's the dark matter that is currently shaping or normalizing a way of behaving that is having huge impacts? And how do we make that visible? And then how do we shift that over time? And so a really kind of a tangible example of that is going, well, what are the barriers, for example, in transport, to me being able to bike everywhere? And it's not just the urban planning rules around how we organize houses and where the key transport nodes are. And actually the fact that it's really easy to park everywhere. And there's limited access to cycle lanes that are safe. But we're also looking at what are the speed limits. So there are layers of laws and invisible rules that influence our behavior. There's a difference between it being really expensive to get on the tube and being cheap to park in town, or being really expensive to park in town. And suddenly you go, how else can I get there? Or actually it's really slow because you can only go two ways.
Right. Right.
And it's also fun. And so when we talk about policy, I think of it manifesting in one of three sort of general buckets. One is regulation, so different standards that kind of influence behaviors. So there's standards, there's like licensing, there's things like zoning and like land use requirements. I think of the second bucket being finance, like taxes, subsidies, grants, loans, loan guarantees. And now I think of it in terms of information and convening. So that's like public awareness and information sharing, storytelling, like data research. So there's so many functions within each of these buckets that is a manifestation of a public authority's power. And when they're used in combination, or when they're first aware of what already exists and how that is serving and stabilizing an existing way of existing, then we start looking at what do we need to do to destabilize this? And how do we, secondly, really importantly, how do we make sure we've got a clear story as to why, so we have the mandate to do so?
Right. Which is what Wales lacked when they put in their 20-mile-an-hour limits. They had not got a clear story as to why, and the mandate dissolved and they had to stop it. So, yeah, having that, yes.
And the combination of that, so that's like a harder power, right? The harder ones are kind of regulations that's going the binary, and you do this or you don't. People don't respond well to that, particularly when it hits to something like my sense of freedom, my sense of comfort, versus some of those softer powers, so to speak, or a mixture of those instruments around public awareness, like gathering, data sharing, like financial incentives. How are we really truly leveraging these other instruments in combination to really start building a way of thinking about operating differently?
And being different.
Exactly.
This is back down to what does it mean to be human, and how do I relate to myself and the people around me and the rest of the web of life? This is behavioral change on a big scale, if it works right.
Yeah, and so that's the key around policy. I think we're often underestimating, or I think it's a bit of a boring revolution, because we have to focus it on a particular challenge and get into the weeds and going, what are the layers of that are currently stabilizing this, or keeping the rules tilted in one way. Yeah. And then how do we go about shifting that? And that's a key one for cities who don't often necessarily have the resources to go to that level of detail. I know Circular in Amsterdam has done a great job in mapping out from a circular economy perspective, what are the regulations, the layers that a public official needs to navigate through to figure out how to build a more circular economy, and how do they do that better? So there is a way of making that system visible. But then the next step is going, well, what's the policy mix? What is the mix of instruments that we can use together in a reflexive manner over time that actually shift behavior? What do we need to remove? Is it a change in regulation? Or actually, is it more administrative? Is it how we're currently interpreting or implementing a current initiative? I've got plenty of examples around procurement, where there are now objectives in certain cities to make choices around green procurement, so certain indicators that are lower carbon or have better social indicators, but nothing's changing. And it's because there was still like a risk aversion to making the wrong decision. And so they then added in a green fund that said, and basically said, if you think that you're going to be spending a bit more money on this choice because it is lower carbon, there is a fund here specifically for that. You know what they found? 80 to 90% of the time, they didn't have to use it. They just went looking.
They just knew it was there.
So it's what are we? But you don't know what the edges are until you engage in the specifics of it. So that's mode is the policy world. It's understanding the dark matter and really working with cities to get specific enough through these policy labs, which it's not a 1-2 workshop wonder. It's committing over a period of time to truly working through these. And we're doing that in the context of plastics in the waste stream, in the context of licensing and permitting and GRESS, looking at the key barriers there. You can get funding for an energy project, but if you can't get it licensed in 3 to 5 years, it's a bit hard to then get that moving.
It doesn't matter. Right. And so much of that's going to be culturally specific, that something that works in Greece might not work in Finland and vice versa. So you've got to be very local. And yet I'm also thinking there must be trans-European things that are at a European level need to shift. So presumably you're doing that vertical conversation of, at some point the EU Commission or whoever it is needs to change the way that something is structured across the EU to make it work better. Yes?
Yeah. Exactly. But in order to do so, in order to do that well, there needs to be a commitment to a level of specificity at a city, regional, and national level of why isn't this working? So there is direct, because I think if it's quite generic in terms of we need help with procurement, or we need a fund that does, suddenly the directives, what you're asking for at an EU level and how that is then transposed to a national context and the level of discretion and how it's transposed and then filtered down, it can easily be watered down. And we're going to see how that plays out with the Green Deal and the transposition of a number of directives in the coming years. But I think that's something to be aware of. And that's why within the Net Zero City Consortia, we've got a team from McLean Eurocities focusing on the EU level policy labs. And then we've focused in simultaneously with them on city level up. How do we start having better conversations and get really specific as to what those barriers are? Are they regulatory, financial, are they a mix of that? Is it a cultural, administrative thing? Like, what are the edges of this? And then how do we help effectively, Emission, what do we need to do to make it move? And how do we unlock that? How does a shift in regulation unlock more finance? How does a shift in how we engage with citizens unlock the mandate to take a stronger position on a certain regulation, etc.?
I am so impressed that this is happening on so many levels. Thank you. Thank you. And it does sound to me, with my political hat on, that if this begins to work and begins to spread, this is progressive work in action. And it's going to, I would assume, gain its own momentum and change the nature of the political conversations that we're having. And that feels really exciting too. I probably interrupted. Was there anything else right at the top of your head that you wanted to say before we finish?
No, I mean,
we could go on forever, obviously.
All day. I think I just think it's fascinating. I feel like it's often an over-talked and underutilized lever. It's the basket that everyone goes, oh, it's a policy issue. And we don't understand what we mean by it and then how we go about it. And so, I'm fascinated in creating the environments of figuring that out, basically.
I'm so pleased that you're there with your legal background and your master's in economics background. You've got everything that you would need in your tool set, and you find it exciting. I mean, how many other people have I ever met who found policy exciting? It's so cool that you're there and you're thinking about it and you're making it happen. Alrighty, I think we're probably done for now. I would love to come back in a couple of years and see where this is going to. So let's pin that for both of us at some point if we're both still around. But in the meantime, Georgia, thank you so much for coming on to the Accidental Goals podcast. This was really inspiring. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I hope to speak to you at some point soon to share how things are going and
the way the world is changing. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you for sending me Any Human Power. I read it a month or two ago and absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
So I have to say I had a pang of fear in my heart when it got to the point where they talked about the different policies that were coming up and the kind of the crowdsourcing of a different way of living to build the manifesto.
Right. Yes.
And it got to the end and it was, I could have come up with it in 5 minutes. And I think what was the comment around, because it was more a reflection of, I think, because many of those who were engaged in coming up with different ways of thinking about laws or building that manifesto, because that muscle hadn't been flexed much.
Yeah, absolutely.
The level of imagination was constrained at that point in time. And it was such a, I almost didn't sleep that night because that's one of my biggest fears is really genuinely is going, well, how do we increase the imagination of what is possible and the different, it's not just the hard, we regulate this tomorrow and it will fix it in a top-down way. It's going, no, what can we remove from needing to have a top-down level of power and just take collective responsibility for and build a mandate around? And how do we build that imagination to create better manifestos? So yeah, that was
You and I need to talk before I write the sequel. What was very interesting about that scene was in the original, I had probably 20 pages of ideas. And then I sat down and realized that those people could not have done that in that space for exactly the reasons you're saying, that they didn't have those muscles and it was not realistic. Also, it was very boring to read. So I took it all away and realized, no, we can't. You've asked too much of these people at this moment in time. and they can't do it. And now we're going to have to work it out in a different way. So I don't expect there's very many other people notice that, but brilliant. And we will talk, sometime before I get the next one, because exactly that. The book ends at a point where everything is possible and nothing is happening yet. And we need to move forward into, okay, now we need to implement stuff, and what's it going to look like? So another conversation. Let's stop this one now, because we don't want to put this out into the world just yet. Thank you. It's been amazing.
Thank you very much.